Imagine for a second that your favorite book's first draft ended up being the final release, or that your favorite movie had all the bloopers and deleted scenes left in. You probably wouldn't enjoy it as much, would you? For some reason, when it comes to photography, there's always this discussion about the purity and sanctity of the image. And you'll often hear people say things like, get it right in camera, or you'll find people boasting about a shot being straight out of camera for one reason or another. And I always found that interesting because when it comes to other forms of media, we embrace the editing process as a necessary thing that creates a more refined, more complete product. But with photography, for some reason, we have this hang up about touching it at all. And I just wanted to talk a bit about that because I think that embracing the editing process will ultimately result in better photographs for you and a better connection to your work. When you go out and you're taking pictures, you choose your settings based on how you want the image to look. But the creation of the image doesn't begin and end at the shutter click. There's so much more that you can do after you get the images home. And you can be as subtle or as intense as you want to be with the edits. You know, you might just do something as simple as basic exposure and color correction, or you can get more detailed. You can do localized adjustments on certain sections of an image. You can mess with the color treatment. You can do it in black and white. There are all kinds of things that you can do. And I think that you're doing yourself a disservice by not giving yourself the chance to explore those possibilities. Sometimes I think that there's an overemphasis on the purity of the image. You know, people will say, well, I want it to look exactly the way it was captured. Well, what does that mean exactly? Because the way your image is captured is based on the settings of your camera. And those settings have a slightly different outcome based on camera brand, camera model. So if you're shooting with a portrait preset or a landscape preset, or if you've gone deep into the menus and you've changed the contrast and the saturation and all of these other kinds of things, each of those settings has an effect on the final image. So when you say that you want to capture it the way it was in the moment, you've already altered it in some way by taking the picture. So I just don't buy that as a good rationale. I also tend to hear things from people who say that it used to not be this way. And when you had to buy film and go and get it developed, that you didn't have all this fancy Photoshop stuff and altering all of these things. But post-processing is not an invention of the digital age. With analog photography, you can change development chemistry for the film itself. You can change the development chemistry when you're making a print. You can change exposure times in the darkroom. There are so many things that you can do in post for an analog photo. So I don't think that argument really holds up either. That even extends to things like dodging, burning, airbrushing. Those are all terms that came from analog photography in the darkroom. Airbrushing using actual retouching paint, for instance. These things are made easier with modern tools, but they're not new. Another common statement that I hear is that the person wants to get it right out of camera because they don't want to have to correct in post. I think that correction is part of creation. When you write something down and you make a typo, you don't leave it in because you don't want to correct, right? You correct your mistake. If you're drawing something, you do a sketch and then maybe you ink it later and then you color it in, you refine your lines and your curves and all of that. And it's an iterative process where you go back and correct the things that you've made mistakes on and you reinforce the things that you're doing correctly. And I don't think photography should be any different. I'll use myself as an example. I often shoot in auto white balance. And that means that my camera is deciding what color temperature to use at any given moment. And when I get home, I may not agree with the settings my camera chose for white balance. So maybe I make the scene a little warmer. Maybe I make it a little cooler. Maybe I think it's too green or too magenta. So I adjust those colors and change the balance to my liking. Sometimes it is based on what I remember of the scene when I was there. And sometimes it's based on what I think looks aesthetically pleasing. It's not a hard rule about how I want the image to be represented. It's really just based on my artistic liberties, I suppose. Another thing that I hear very frequently is the notion of journalistic integrity. And journalistic integrity is important if you're a photojournalist. If you go and you look at the policies of any newswire or news publication, they have very clear guidelines about what kinds of alterations are allowed and not allowed. And most of them allow general exposure correction, color correction, and cropping. What they don't allow is making alterations to the image that would change the way the story of the photo is told. But if you're not shooting for press, then what's the problem? You know, if you're shooting for yourself, if you're doing this as a hobby, if you're doing this to make fine art, if you're doing this for any number of reasons that are not photojournalism, then there's really no need to be attached to the photojournalistic standard. I think it's placing an undue restriction on yourself. And that kind of brings me to the next thing. It really is your choice if you'd rather not do any editing. I think that you can still be creative straight out of camera if that's what you choose to do. There are also lots of things that you can do before the shot to alter your photos. There are specialized filters that you can add on top of your lens. People modify the sensors on their cameras to shoot in infrared and do all kinds of other things. And I think that if those are fair game, then going into Lightroom and changing the color balance and the saturation should also be fair game. But ultimately, it's your decision of what to do. And I don't think that choosing to edit or not makes you a better or worse photographer. It just makes you different. And I'd really just like for people to embrace editing if it's something that they're apprehensive about. Because I know that I was apprehensive about it in the beginning. I was very hesitant to alter my photographs. And part of that was also because I just didn't know what editing could do. I had no idea. I thought that Photoshop was just like making crazy collages and composites and doing transformations. And that's really not what I wanted to do with my photography. So I was also in the camp of, I want to capture it the way it was intended. Then I realized something important about the editing process. And that is that editing is a form of refinement. It's a form of revision. And just like all the examples that I gave earlier with movies and television and writing and all kinds of art, ultimately you end up with a better result. I think that personally, embracing editing has allowed me to take good photos and make them great. And maybe that's not true for you, but I won't judge you if you don't judge me. What are your thoughts on editing? Do you do it a lot, a little bit? Have you been avoiding it? Let me know. I really hope to keep doing more of these in the new year. So stay tuned and I'll see you next time.